The ballroom of the Art Institute of Chicago was quiet enough to hear the clink of crystal glasses. Bruce Caldwell stood among investors and reporters, smiling the way powerful men did when they believed the room belonged to them. Yes, them. Then he noticed the elderly woman near the entrance. Her coat was simple, her handbag worn. Bruce laughed lightly and waved a hand toward security. Someone should escort this beggar out. A few people chuckled. Vanessa Hartley did not even try to hide her smile. Across the room, Georgia Winslow said nothing. Margaret Winslow simply looked at Bruce Caldwell. He had no idea the woman he had just humiliated held the signed documents proving he owed her millions. And before the night was over, that quiet truth would begin to surface. Before we continue, take a moment to tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Stories like this travel far, and it's always remarkable to see how many corners of the world understand the quiet weight of dignity. And if you believe that sometimes the strongest response to humiliation isn't anger, but patience, consider subscribing to the channel. Because some stories don't rush their justice. Now let's begin. From the outside, the marriage of Georgia Winslow and Bruce Caldwell looked like a story of disciplined success. They lived in a quiet neighborhood just north of downtown Chicago in a restored brick townhouse whose tall windows faced a narrow street lined with maple trees. The kind of street where cars were washed on Sunday mornings and holiday wreaths appeared on doors with almost synchronized timing each December. Bruce liked that neighborhood. It suggested stability. He liked the townhouse even more. It suggested success. And success was the story Bruce Caldwell had spent most of his adult life carefully writing. Georgia, on the other hand, had never been interested in writing stories about appearances. She had always been more interested in facts. People often mistook her silence for passivity. In reality, silence was simply the way Georgia observed the world. She noticed details. The way someone paused before answering a question. The way a receipt appeared in a jacket pocket that hadn't been worn the day before. The way a person's voice changed when they believed no one was really listening. Those habits had been taught to her long before she met Bruce. Her mother, Margaret Winslow, had raised Georgia with a simple rule. If something matters, write it down. When Georgia was a child, Margaret kept small notebooks everywhere in their home. Grocery lists, phone numbers, business calls, even conversations that seemed unimportant at the time. Memory is unreliable, Margaret would say calmly. Paper isn't. At the time, Georgia had assumed it was simply her mother's personality. Years later, she would understand it was something else. Protection. But on the day Georgia first met Bruce Caldwell, none of that seemed particularly important. Bruce had entered the room with the easy confidence of a man who knew people were already paying attention. He had been handsome in a polished, ambitious way. His suits were always slightly sharper than everyone else's. His voice slightly louder. His plans always just a little bigger. At the time, Bruce was not yet the CEO of Caldwell Development Group. Back then, he was simply a young developer with an aggressive vision for commercial real estate projects across the Midwest. Georgia met him at a networking event for local entrepreneurs. She had been helping organize the event through a small consulting firm she worked with after graduate school. Bruce noticed her because she wasn't trying to be noticed. While most people in the room were moving quickly from one conversation to another, Georgia stayed near the back table organizing paperwork and making sure the guest list matched the attendance sheet. Bruce walked over and introduced himself. "You're the only person in this room who isn't selling something," he had said with a half smile. Georgia looked up at him calmly. "I'm selling organization," she replied. Bruce laughed. It was the beginning of a relationship that for several years seemed to work. Bruce liked Georgia because she made his life more orderly. Georgia liked Bruce because he moved through the world with a certainty she had never particularly cared to develop herself. For a while, their differences complemented each other. Bruce was the one who made the big decisions. Georgia was the one who quietly made sure the consequences were manageable. When Bruce launched his first development company, Georgia helped him organize vendor contracts and manage appointment schedules. When Bruce began attracting investors, Georgia handled spreadsheets and communications. Bruce liked to describe himself as the architect of the company. Georgia never corrected him. But if someone had examined the early records of Caldwell Development Group, they would have noticed something interesting. Many of the systems that kept the company running had originally been designed by Georgia. Still, Bruce's ambition was the engine that pushed the business forward. Over the years, Caldwell Development began securing larger projects: retail complexes, apartment buildings, office renovations. With each successful deal, Bruce's confidence grew stronger. And with that confidence came something else: distance. It didn't happen suddenly. At first, it was simply longer work hours, then business trips, then dinners with investors that Georgia wasn't invited to. Bruce always had a reasonable explanation. "You wouldn't enjoy these meetings," he would say casually while adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. "It's mostly finance talk." Georgia would nod. She didn't argue. But she did begin noticing patterns. Bruce's phone started remaining face down on the table more often. His email notifications were suddenly muted. There were new charges on their shared credit card accounts that Bruce explained as business expenses, though the descriptions were vague. Restaurants she had never heard of. Flights that didn't always appear on the company travel calendar. Georgia never confronted him directly. Confrontation required certainty, and Georgia preferred evidence. So she did what she had been taught to do since childhood. She started keeping records. At first, the notes were simple. Dates Bruce returned home unusually late. Names of restaurants on credit card statements. Travel confirmations that appeared briefly on shared email threads before being deleted. Georgia didn't make assumptions. She simply wrote things down. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, while Bruce was out playing golf with investors, Georgia sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She created a private folder. Inside that folder, she began saving copies of financial statements and travel confirmations that passed through the household accounts. It wasn't an accusation. It was documentation. Georgia didn't yet know exactly what she was documenting. But the quiet instinct her mother had taught her many years ago had begun whispering something unmistakable. Something in Bruce's carefully constructed life was no longer aligned with the story he was telling. And Georgia Winslow had learned long ago that stories and records were rarely the same thing. By the time Bruce returned home that evening, Georgia had already closed her laptop and placed the notebook she had been writing in back inside a kitchen drawer. Bruce walked in, loosened his tie, and kissed her lightly on the cheek. "Long day?" he asked. Georgia smiled politely, not particularly. Bruce poured himself a drink and began talking about a potential development project near the lakefront. Georgia listened. She always listened. And while Bruce spoke confidently about the future he was building, Georgia quietly added another note to the mental record she had begun keeping. Not about the project, about Bruce. Because the man standing in their kitchen was beginning to feel like someone she was still learning how to observe. And observation, Georgia knew, was often the first step toward understanding what people were trying very hard not to reveal. Margaret Winslow had spent most of her life being underestimated. It was something she had learned to recognize early, and eventually something she learned to use. At first glance, there was nothing about Margaret that suggested power. She dressed simply, often in neutral coats that had lasted her many winters, and shoes chosen more for comfort than style. Her hair, once dark, had long since faded into soft gray that she tied neatly at the back of her neck. In a city like Chicago, where status was often displayed through designer labels and polished confidence, Margaret looked almost invisible. That invisibility had always suited her. When Georgia was growing up, Margaret ran a small financial firm called Winslow Capital Lending. It wasn't a large institution. There were no towering downtown offices or flashy advertisements. The firm operated quietly from a modest office building on the edge of the financial district. But within certain circles, particularly among small business owners and developers who struggled to secure traditional bank loans, Margaret Winslow had a reputation that carried weight. She specialized in something banks often avoided: Private lending. Developers with promising projects but imperfect credit histories. Family businesses that needed short-term capital to expand. Entrepreneurs caught between opportunity and financial hesitation. Margaret evaluated them all with careful attention. She never made decisions quickly. Her desk was always covered with documents, loan applications, business plans, property assessments, tax filings. She read everything personally: numbers, signatures, collateral agreements. Nothing passed through Winslow Capital without Margaret understanding every page. Many borrowers assumed her calm demeanor meant she was soft. Those borrowers rarely made that mistake twice. Margaret's contracts were precise. Her repayment schedules were clear. Her expectations were written in language that left little room for confusion. But Margaret was not cruel. If someone struggled to meet a payment and came to her honestly, she would listen. Sometimes she adjusted timelines. Occasionally she restructured interest terms. But there was one thing she never tolerated: dishonesty. Georgia had seen that side of her mother exactly once when she was 19 years old. A developer had attempted to hide the sale of a property that was part of his collateral agreement with Winslow Capital. Margaret didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply placed a copy of the contract on the table in front of him, pointed to the relevant clause, and calmly explained the legal consequences. The man had paid the entire outstanding balance within 2 weeks. That was the nature of Margaret Winslow's authority. Quiet, precise, unavoidable. By the time Georgia met Bruce Caldwell years later, Margaret had already begun reducing her involvement in the business. Her husband had passed away unexpectedly after a brief illness, and Margaret decided she no longer wanted the daily responsibility of managing dozens of loans and investment accounts. Winslow Capital lending slowly scaled down. Existing loans were honored and completed, but Margaret stopped actively seeking new borrowers. Instead, she focused on managing the family's remaining investments and living a quieter life. When Georgia introduced Bruce to her, Margaret had welcomed him politely. She had observed him the way she observed all people, patiently, without immediate judgment. Bruce, however, formed his own opinion quickly. The first time he visited Margaret's home, he noticed the modest furniture and the lack of visible luxury. No expensive art, no designer decor. Just a clean, well-kept house filled with books and neatly organized documents. Bruce had smiled politely during dinner, but later that evening, when he and Georgia were driving home, he made a comment that Georgia never forgot. "Your mother lives like someone who never figured out how to enjoy money." Georgia had glanced at him briefly from the passenger's seat. "My mother believes money is a tool," she said calmly, "not a lifestyle." Bruce chuckled lightly. "Well, tools are meant to build something bigger." Georgia didn't respond. Margaret, for her part, never commented on Bruce's attitude. But she noticed it. Margaret noticed many things about Bruce Caldwell. His eagerness to talk about future deals before explaining current numbers. His tendency to describe financial success in large, confident projections rather than documented results. His comfort with risk. None of these qualities were necessarily negative. Ambition often required them. But Margaret had spent too many years in lending to ignore patterns when they appeared. So when Bruce came to her 10 years earlier with a proposal for financial help during the most difficult moment of his early career, Margaret didn't answer immediately. She asked questions, a great many questions. Bruce had been struggling at the time. His first large development project, a mixed retail and residential building outside Evanston, had stalled when one of his investors suddenly withdrew funding. The bank financing tied to that investment collapsed almost immediately afterward. Construction stopped. Contractors demanded payment. And Bruce Caldwell found himself staring at the very real possibility of bankruptcy. It was Georgia who suggested he speak with Margaret. Bruce resisted the idea at first. He didn't like the thought of borrowing money from family. But desperation has a way of softening pride. Eventually, Bruce agreed. He arrived at Margaret's house one evening with a folder full of project documents and a carefully prepared explanation. Margaret listened. She didn't interrupt while Bruce described the project, the potential profit, and the temporary nature of the financial crisis he was facing. When he finished speaking, Margaret asked only one question. "How much do you need to stabilize the project?" Bruce hesitated slightly. Then he answered, "3.2 million." Margaret nodded slowly. She didn't react with surprise. Instead, she reached for a legal pad and began writing notes. "What collateral can you offer?" she asked. Bruce blinked. "Collateral." Margaret looked up calmly. "If Winslow Capital is lending $3.2 million, the loan requires security." Bruce glanced at Georgia. Georgia simply sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Margaret continued writing. "The property itself can serve as primary collateral," she said. "But I'll also need a promissory note and repayment schedule." Bruce swallowed. The conversation had shifted from family support to formal lending faster than he expected. But he agreed. Within 2 weeks, the paperwork was complete. Winslow Capital Lending transferred $3.2 million into Bruce's development account. Construction resumed. And Caldwell Development Group survived its first major crisis. At the time, Bruce had been genuinely grateful. He shook Margaret's hand and promised something with complete confidence. "I won't forget what you did for me." Margaret simply nodded. She had heard that sentence many times in her career. Experience had taught her that gratitude was often temporary. Contracts, however, lasted much longer. And Margaret Winslow always made sure her contracts were written very carefully. Years later, as Bruce Caldwell stood inside the glittering ballroom of the Art Institute and laughed while calling her a beggar, Margaret did not remind him of that promise. She didn't need to, because the documents that proved exactly who owed what were still sitting safely inside a locked cabinet in her home office. Waiting. 10 years earlier, Bruce Caldwell had not looked like the man who stood confidently at charity galas. At that time, the office of Caldwell Development Group occupied a narrow second-floor suite above a printing shop in Evanston. The carpet was worn. The furniture had been purchased second-hand. The conference table was little more than a long wooden slab balanced on 2 metal frames. But Bruce believed in the future of the company with absolute certainty. The Evanston project had been meant to prove him right. It was a mid-sized development retail space on the first-floor apartments above. A clean design, attractive location, and a business plan Bruce had spent months presenting to potential investors. For a while, everything had gone according to plan. Construction began. Contracts were signed. Investors committed capital. Then one investor withdrew without warning. The timing was devastating. Without that portion of funding, the bank financing attached to the project immediately froze. Contractors stopped showing up. Subcontractors demanded payment for materials already delivered. Within 3 weeks, Bruce's entire project was standing half-built behind temporary fencing. Bills arrived faster than Bruce could open them. He stopped answering some calls entirely. When Georgia visited the construction site one afternoon, she found Bruce standing near the unfinished structure, staring at the exposed steel framework. It was late autumn. Cold wind moved through the open floors of the building. Bruce didn't speak when she approached. He simply held a folded notice in his hand. "What is it?" Georgia asked quietly. Bruce handed her the paper. It was a formal letter from the bank. Loan suspension pending capital verification. Georgia read it carefully. "When do you need the money?" she asked. Bruce exhaled slowly. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe less. Georgia nodded once. "And if you don't have it?" Bruce gave a short laugh that didn't contain any humor. "Then Caldwell Development ends before it ever really begins." They stood there for a moment in silence. Georgia looked up at the unfinished building. Then she looked back at Bruce. "You should talk to my mother." Bruce reacted immediately. "No." The answer came faster than Georgia expected. "She doesn't run that lending business anymore," Bruce continued. "And I'm not asking your family to bail me out." Georgia studied him calmly. "She might be willing to help if the project makes sense." Bruce shook his head. I'm not walking into your mother's house asking for $3 million. Georgia didn't argue. She simply said something that Bruce hadn't expected. You're not asking her for $3 million. Bruce frowned slightly. You're asking her for a loan. The distinction mattered. Even Bruce understood that. A loan was business. A bailout was failure. 2 days later, Bruce sat across from Margaret Winslow at her dining room table. Margaret had asked him to bring all project documentation. Bruce arrived with a leather folder containing architectural plans, projected revenue models, contractor agreements, and financing terms. Margaret listened carefully while Bruce explained everything. She rarely interrupted. Occasionally, she wrote notes on a yellow legal pad. Georgia sat quietly nearby, reading through the documents Bruce had brought. When Bruce finished describing the project's financial gap, Margaret closed the folder and leaned back slightly in her chair. How much is required to stabilize the construction timeline? She asked. Bruce cleared his throat. $3.2 million. Margaret nodded. And what portion of the project would that represent? Bruce pointed to a section of the financial summary. About 26% of the total investment. Margaret studied the numbers for a long moment. Then she asked another question. What security can you offer for the loan? Bruce hesitated. The question felt clinical, but he answered. The property itself can serve as collateral, he said. The development rights are already registered under Caldwell Development. Margaret nodded again. That will be the primary collateral, she said. But I'll also require a promissory note and repayment schedule. Bruce shifted slightly in his chair. He had hoped the conversation might remain informal. Margaret's tone suggested otherwise. Georgia spoke quietly. My mother never mixes business and family. Margaret didn't look at her daughter, but a faint smile appeared on her face. It prevents misunderstandings, she said. Bruce thought about the unfinished building standing in cold wind. He thought about the contractors waiting for payment. And he realized that pride was far less important than survival. What interest rate are you proposing? He asked. Margaret slid a sheet of paper across the table. The rate was significantly lower than the private lending options Bruce had been considering. But the repayment terms were precise. 5 years, quarterly payments, full transparency of financial statements during the loan period. Bruce read the terms carefully. Then he looked up. This is fair, he said. Margaret nodded once. Good. Within 10 days, the paperwork was complete. A formal promissory note was drafted by a Chicago financial attorney. The agreement included the full loan amount, $3.2 million, a defined repayment schedule, the Evanston property as collateral, a clause requiring written communication for any extension requests. Bruce signed the document. Margaret signed it afterward. 2 days later, Winslow Capital Lending transferred the full amount into the Caldwell Development construction account. The effect was immediate. Contractors returned to the site. Construction resumed. Within 18 months, the Evanston development was completed and fully leased. It became the project Bruce used in nearly every future investor presentation. The project that proved Caldwell Development was legitimate. The project that built Bruce Caldwell's reputation. And for the first 2 years after the loan, Bruce honored the agreement. Quarterly payments arrived exactly on schedule. Margaret recorded each one in her ledgers. Then something began to change. As Caldwell Development expanded, Bruce's projects grew larger. New investors joined the company. New opportunities appeared. Bruce started describing the Evanston project as the foundation of everything that came later. But he mentioned the loan less frequently. At first, the change was subtle. A payment that arrived a week late, then 2 weeks, then a request for an extension on the following quarter. Margaret approved the extension, but she documented it. Every email, every revised payment schedule, every confirmation Bruce sent acknowledging the outstanding balance. Bruce rarely noticed how carefully those records were maintained. By the 5th year, Bruce had repaid only a portion of the original loan. and eventually the payments stopped entirely. Bruce told himself something that many ambitious people believe once success begins to surround them: that past obligations somehow become less urgent than present opportunities. He assumed Margaret would never enforce the agreement. After all, she was his mother-in-law, and Georgia never mentioned the loan anymore. To Bruce, the debt gradually faded into something abstract: an old arrangement, a family understanding, a detail buried in the early chapters of his career. Margaret Winslow never corrected that assumption. She simply continued doing what she had always done. She kept the records, every email, every bank transfer, every confirmation Bruce sent acknowledging the debt. 10 years later, those records remained exactly where Margaret had placed them. Inside a locked cabinet in her home office, neatly organized, undisturbed, and still legally binding. Vanessa Hartley entered Bruce Caldwell's life the way certain changes always did in companies that had grown quickly, quietly, at first almost invisibly. She joined Caldwell Development Group as a marketing director during the company's 9th year of expansion. By that point, Bruce's firm had already moved from its modest Evanston office into a polished glass building in downtown Chicago. The reception area had marble floors. The conference rooms had panoramic views of the lake. Bruce liked those views. They reminded visitors that his company had reached a level of credibility that was difficult to question. Vanessa Chano arrived with an impressive resume and the confidence of someone who knew how to navigate rooms filled with ambitious people. She was 29, sharply dressed, and had previously worked for a commercial branding agency that specialized in real estate developments. Her job at Caldwell Development was simple on paper: rebrand the company, present Bruce's projects as visionary, make Caldwell Development appear larger than it already was. Vanessa proved good at the task. Within a few months, the company's presentations looked more polished. Investor meetings ran smoother. Marketing materials for upcoming developments began appearing in industry magazines. Bruce appreciated efficiency, but he appreciated admiration even more. Vanessa provided both. Their first conversations were entirely professional. She asked thoughtful questions about the company's projects and future plans. Bruce enjoyed explaining his ideas to someone who listened with genuine interest. Georgia met Vanessa briefly during a company dinner not long after her hiring. The event took place at a restaurant along the Chicago River where Bruce had reserved a long table for senior employees and investors. Vanessa sat 2 seats away from Bruce, explaining a new branding concept for an upcoming development in Oak Park. Georgia noticed several things that evening: the way Vanessa leaned slightly toward Bruce when speaking, the way Bruce allowed her to finish every sentence without interruption, the way their conversation occasionally continued quietly while others at the table spoke. None of it was inappropriate. Not yet. But Georgia had always been skilled at recognizing early patterns. That night, when Bruce and Georgia returned home, Bruce mentioned Vanessa again. "She's very sharp," he said while loosening his tie. "Exactly the kind of energy this company needs." Georgia nodded. She seemed competent. Bruce smiled slightly. Competent is an understatement. The comment might have meant nothing. Georgia didn't react, but she remembered it. Over the following months, Vanessa's presence inside the company became more noticeable. She accompanied Bruce to investor meetings. She attended site inspections for new developments. She began appearing in photographs that Caldwell Development shared on its professional social media accounts. Bruce explained it easily. She handles the public image of the company now. Georgia didn't object. In truth, Georgia had gradually stepped away from the company years earlier. As Caldwell Development expanded, Bruce preferred to surround himself with employees who treated him as a CEO rather than a husband. Georgia had never insisted on a formal role. Her interests had shifted toward consulting work and volunteer projects within the city. But distance created space for observation. And Georgia began noticing small details that Bruce assumed would go unnoticed. Bruce started coming home later, not every night, just often enough to create a pattern. His phone was no longer left casually on the kitchen counter. Instead, it remained in his jacket pocket or turned face down on the dining table. His work trips increased. Again, not dramatically, just slightly more frequent, slightly longer. Georgia never asked direct questions. Instead, she followed the rule Margaret had taught her. If something matters, write it down. The notebook she had placed in the kitchen drawer months earlier began filling with short entries. Dates, flight numbers, credit card charges, restaurants, hotels. Nothing dramatic, just information. One evening, while Bruce was showering after returning from a 2-day investor meeting in Milwaukee, his phone lit briefly on the bedside table. Georgia wasn't looking for it, but the screen lit up in the dark room. A message preview appeared. Vanessa dinner tonight was worth the drive. Georgia looked at the screen for only a second before the display went dark again. She didn't pick up the phone. She didn't scroll through messages. Instead, she quietly opened the notebook and wrote down the date and time. Later that week, Georgia was reviewing the household credit card statements when she noticed a charge from a small Italian restaurant in downtown Chicago. The receipt timestamp read 11:42 p.m. Bruce had told her he was staying late at the office that evening. Georgia opened her laptop and checked the restaurant's location. It was less than 3 blocks from Caldwell Development's office. Again, she didn't confront Bruce. She simply recorded the information. Patterns required patience, and Georgia had always been patient. Weeks turned into months. Vanessa's role inside the company continued expanding. She began attending events that Bruce previously would have invited Georgia to. Real estate conferences, networking receptions, industry dinners. When Georgia occasionally asked how the events had gone, Bruce answered casually, "Just business." Georgia would nod, then write down the date. One night, Bruce returned home later than usual. It was past midnight. Georgia was sitting in the living room reading. Bruce walked in quietly, clearly expecting the house to be dark. "Oh," he said when he saw her. "You're still awake. I couldn't sleep," Georgia replied. Bruce poured himself a drink in the kitchen. "Long day," he added. Georgia closed her book. "Where were you?" Bruce didn't hesitate. "Investor dinner. New project discussion." Georgia nodded slowly. "Which restaurant?" Bruce paused. "Just briefly. Some steakhouse near the office," he said. Georgia smiled faintly. "That sounds productive." Bruce returned the smile and finished his drink. He didn't notice Georgia writing something in the notebook after he went upstairs. What Bruce didn't realize was that Georgia had already seen the credit card receipt earlier that evening. The charge had come from a rooftop lounge overlooking the river, not a steakhouse. And the receipt had been signed by Bruce Caldwell for 2 people. The following week, Georgia quietly began creating a digital folder on her laptop. Inside the folder, she saved copies of financial statements connected to the household accounts, travel confirmations, calendar entries, expense reports that occasionally appeared through Bruce's company email when he forwarded documents to their shared address. Georgia wasn't building a case. Not yet. She was building a record, because something about Bruce's life had begun to separate into 2 distinct versions. The one he described, and the one that appeared quietly in receipts, timestamps, and brief messages that illuminated his phone screen late at night. Georgia didn't know how large that difference would become. But she understood one thing clearly. Truth rarely revealed itself all at once. It emerged slowly, line by line, entry by entry, just like the notes filling the pages of the small notebook she kept hidden inside the kitchen drawer. Margaret Winslow never believed that time erased a debt. Time simply changed how people remembered it. In her experience, borrowers often treated financial obligations the way people treated uncomfortable conversations. At first, they acknowledged them. Then they postponed them. Eventually, they behaved as if the subject had never existed at all. But paper did not forget. And Margaret Winslow trusted paper more than memory. The file related to Bruce Caldwell's loan occupied a single drawer in the locking cabinet inside Margaret's home office. The cabinet itself was old steel gray, slightly scratched from years of use, but its contents were arranged with the same precision Margaret had practiced throughout her career. Inside the drawer were several folders. Each folder carried a date. The first folder was labeled simply Caldwell Development. Initial loan agreement inside were the original documents from 10 years earlier. The promissory note, signed by Bruce Caldwell. The collateral agreement listing the Evanston development property. The wire transfer confirmation from Winslow Capital Lending, transferring $3.2 million to Caldwell Development's operating account. Margaret had reviewed those documents many times, not because she doubted their accuracy, but because reviewing records had always been part of her discipline. After the initial agreement came the second folder, Payment Schedule, Years 1, 2. Those pages showed Bruce Caldwell at his most reliable. Quarterly payments had arrived exactly as promised. Every 3 months, Caldwell Development wired a scheduled amount into the Winslow Capital account. Margaret recorded each payment by hand in a ledger she kept beside the folder. She noted the date, the amount, the remaining balance. At that time, Bruce's gratitude had still been visible. Occasionally, his email messages included sentences like, "I appreciate your patience while the company grows," or, "We wouldn't be here without your support." Margaret had replied politely. But she never saved the compliments. She saved the confirmations. Then came the third folder, Payment Adjustments, Years 3, 5. That folder told a slightly different story. The payments had not stopped, but they had begun arriving later, a week late, then 2 weeks. Then Bruce requested an adjustment. Margaret could still recall the phone call. "Business is expanding faster than expected," Bruce had explained confidently. "The cash flow cycles are shifting with new projects." Margaret listened quietly. "Are you asking to revise the payment schedule?" she asked. "Just temporarily," Bruce said. 6 months, maybe less." Margaret had agreed. But she followed her usual process. She sent Bruce an email confirming the adjustment terms. The email included a sentence Margaret always required when modifying a contract. "Please reply confirming that you acknowledge the outstanding balance remains active under the original loan agreement." Bruce had responded within 15 minutes. Confirmed. "Thank you for your flexibility." Margaret printed the email. She placed it in the folder, because written acknowledgement mattered. Years later, those acknowledgements would matter even more. The fourth folder carried a different label. Final payments received inside were only 3 documents. 3 payments. After that, the transfers stopped entirely. At first, Margaret assumed the delay was temporary. Developers often experienced uneven revenue cycles, but weeks turned into months. Then an entire quarter passed. Margaret sent Bruce a short message. "Bruce, I noticed the last payment has not arrived. Please advise if there has been an administrative delay." Bruce's response came 2 days later. "Things are a bit complicated right now with new projects launching. I'll circle back soon." Margaret printed the email, placed it in the file, and waited. She did not send aggressive reminders. She did not threaten legal action, because Georgia was still married to Bruce. Margaret understood something many lenders did not. Financial pressure inside a family could fracture relationships far beyond the money itself. So she waited. Occasionally, she sent polite messages asking for updates. Bruce's replies became shorter over time, sometimes vague, sometimes delayed. Eventually, they stopped altogether. Margaret didn't chase him. She simply continued maintaining the file. Then one afternoon, about 4 years after the last payment, Bruce sent an unexpected email. It was brief. "Margaret, I know we still need to resolve the remaining balance from the Evanston project loan. I haven't forgotten. We'll work something out soon." Margaret read the message carefully. Then she printed it and placed it in the folder. That email mattered, because it confirmed something important. Bruce Caldwell still acknowledged the debt. Under Illinois contract law, written acknowledgement could extend the enforceability of certain financial obligations. Margaret understood that. Bruce likely did not. which was why Margaret never reminded him. Silence often allowed people to reveal more than arguments ever could. Years passed. Caldwell Development continued growing. Bruce appeared in industry publications. His company secured new investment partnerships. Photographs from charity events occasionally appeared online. Georgia visited Margaret regularly during those years. They rarely discussed the loan, not because Georgia had forgotten, but because Georgia understood her mother's habits. Margaret never forced action before the right moment. One evening, not long before the charity gala where Bruce would publicly insult her, Georgia sat at Margaret's kitchen table reviewing a set of documents. "Do you still have the file?" Georgia asked quietly. Margaret poured tea into 2 cups. "I still have all of them," she replied. Georgia looked up. How many confirmations did he send over the years? Margaret considered the question. 7 written acknowledgments, she said calmly. Georgia nodded slowly. That number mattered. Margaret placed a thin folder on the table. Inside were printed copies of Bruce's emails confirming the debt. Each one carried his signature line. Bruce Caldwell, CEO, Caldwell Development Group. Georgia studied the pages carefully. She noticed something Margaret had known all along. Bruce's tone changed over time. The first messages were respectful. The later ones sounded dismissive. But every message contained the same crucial element: acknowledgement. Georgia closed the folder. "He thought you would never enforce it," she said. Margaret smiled faintly. Many people think that about quiet lenders. Georgia returned the documents to the folder. "Did you ever consider filing a claim earlier?" she asked. Margaret shook her head. "You were married," she said simply. That answer carried more weight than Georgia expected. Margaret wasn't protecting Bruce. She had been protecting Georgia. Georgia sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked a different question. "If it ever becomes necessary, do you still have everything required to enforce the agreement?" Margaret looked toward the gray filing cabinet across the room. "Yes," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was no hesitation, because Margaret Winslow had built an entire career on one principle. When money changed hands, documentation followed, and documentation, unlike pride, gratitude, or family relationships, did not fade with time. It remained exactly as it had been written, waiting patiently. The ballroom of the Art Institute of Chicago had been arranged with the kind of precision that large charitable events required. Round tables draped in white linen filled the center of the room. Tall arrangements of white orchids and glass candle cylinders reflected softly against polished floors. Along one side of the hall, a quiet trio played jazz standards while servers moved between guests carrying silver trays of champagne. The annual Caldwell Development Charity Gala had grown into one of the company's most visible public events. Bruce liked that. He liked the cameras. He liked the speeches. Most of all, he liked the atmosphere of admiration that surrounded a man who appeared successful and generous at the same time. That evening, Bruce stood near the center of the room, speaking with a small group of investors. He looked exactly the way he liked to look at events like this: confident, relaxed, in control. Beside him stood Vanessa Hartley, wearing a black evening dress that matched the understated elegance of the event. She was speaking easily with 2 board members from a construction firm that had recently partnered with Caldwell Development. Bruce introduced her as part of the company's leadership team. No one questioned it. Vanessa had attended several company events by that point. Her presence felt natural to people who didn't know the history of Bruce's marriage. Across the room, Georgia Winslow stood near the entrance, speaking quietly with a representative from one of the charities benefiting from the evening's fundraising. Georgia wore a navy dress that was simple but elegant. She carried herself with the same calm composure she had always displayed at public events beside Bruce. Many guests greeted her warmly. Some had known her since the earliest days of Caldwell Development. Others knew her simply as Bruce Caldwell's wife. Georgia smiled politely and listened, but she noticed something that many others did not. Bruce had barely looked at her since the evening began. His attention remained near Vanessa's side of the room. It was not dramatic, not obvious, just another pattern. Georgia had become very familiar with patterns. At around 8 o'clock, the main doors of the ballroom opened again. Most people barely noticed, but Georgia did. Standing near the entrance was Margaret Winslow. She wore a gray wool coat over a dark dress. The coat looked older than most of the designer jackets filling the room that evening, but it was clean and carefully pressed. Margaret paused near the doorway, taking in the scene quietly. She had only agreed to attend because Georgia asked her to. Public charity events had never interested Margaret. She preferred environments where conversation mattered more than appearances. But Georgia had said something during their last phone call. It would mean something to me if you came. Margaret never ignored requests that sounded like that. So she had arrived. A few people near the entrance glanced at her politely, assuming she was another guest arriving late. Margaret moved slowly through the room, her eyes adjusting to the warm lighting. Eventually, she saw Georgia standing across the ballroom. Georgia noticed her at the same moment. Their eyes met. Georgia smiled. Margaret returned the smile and began walking toward her daughter. Unfortunately, someone else noticed Margaret at the same time. Bruce Caldwell had just finished speaking with one of the investors when his gaze drifted toward the entrance of the ballroom. For a moment, he didn't recognize the figure walking slowly between the tables. Then he did. Margaret Winslow. Bruce felt an immediate flash of irritation. He hadn't expected her to attend. In truth, he had not even considered the possibility. Margaret rarely appeared at public events connected to his company. Her presence in the room felt strangely out of place to him. She moved quietly through the elegant crowd, wearing that same practical coat she had owned for years. Bruce's irritation sharpened into something more uncomfortable. Embarrassment. He noticed a few people glancing curiously at the older woman who did not quite match the polished image of the gala. Vanessa followed Bruce's gaze. "Who's that?" she asked softly. Bruce gave a short laugh. "That," he said lightly, "is my mother-in-law." Vanessa raised an eyebrow slightly. "She looks modest." Bruce took a sip of champagne. Modest is one way to describe it. A small group around them chuckled politely. Bruce shouldn't have said anything else. The comment could have ended there. But something about the room, the attention, and Vanessa's amused expression pushed Bruce a little further than usual. Margaret had almost reached Georgia when Bruce spoke again, this time loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. "Honestly," Bruce said with a dismissive wave of his hand, "someone should probably escort that beggar out before she starts asking for donations." The words hung in the air. At first, the people closest to him didn't react. They assumed it must have been a joke, but Vanessa laughed. Not loudly, just enough. The sound made the moment real. A few nearby guests shifted uncomfortably. Across the room, Georgia heard the sentence clearly. She didn't move. She didn't speak. But her attention fixed quietly on Bruce. Margaret had also heard him. She stopped walking. For a moment, she simply looked at Bruce across the room. There was no anger in her expression, no embarrassment either, just calm recognition. Margaret had spent decades observing people in moments when their character revealed itself without preparation. Bruce Caldwell was having one of those moments. He stood in a room full of investors and partners holding a champagne glass and smiling casually as if he had just delivered a clever remark. Vanessa was still smiling beside him. Georgia remained perfectly still. Margaret slowly removed her coat. She folded it neatly over one arm. Then she continued walking. When she reached Georgia, the two women embraced briefly. Neither of them looked back at Bruce immediately. The surrounding guests returned to their conversations, though a faint tension remained in the air. A few people glanced between Bruce and the two women across the room. Bruce didn't seem concerned. In fact, he appeared amused. Vanessa leaned closer to him. "Did she hear you?" she asked quietly. Bruce shrugged. If she did, maybe she'll finally realize these events aren't her scene. Vanessa smirked. Bruce lifted his glass again, already turning back toward the investors he had been speaking with. The moment seemed trivial to him, just another careless comment, Another passing joke. But across the room, Margaret Winslow looked once more in Bruce Caldwell's direction. Her expression remained calm, almost thoughtful, because Margaret understood something Bruce had forgotten. Debts did not disappear simply because people stopped talking about them. And humiliation, especially public humiliation, had a strange way of changing the timing of certain decisions. Margaret didn't say anything to Georgia that evening about what Bruce had done. She didn't confront him. She didn't even approach him. Instead, she stayed beside her daughter through the rest of the gala, speaking politely with the charity organizers and thanking them for their work. To anyone watching, the moment had already passed. But Margaret Winslow knew something Bruce Caldwell did not. The quiet balance between patience and action had just shifted. And Bruce had no idea how much of his life still rested on documents with his signature. The gala ended shortly after 10:30. Guests drifted out of the ballroom in small groups, their conversations fading into the quiet marble hallways of the Art Institute. Outside, the cool Chicago night carried the low hum of traffic along Michigan Avenue. Bruce remained inside longer than most. He liked staying until the final guests left. It gave him time to shake hands, exchange final business cards, and accept the lingering compliments that came with hosting an event like that. Vanessa stayed near him through most of it. Across the room earlier, Georgia had noticed that Vanessa no longer made any effort to appear discreet. Their proximity had become casual, comfortable, almost routine. But Georgia did not mention it. When the last of the charity organizers thanked Bruce for the evening's donations and success, he checked his watch and realized Georgia was no longer in the ballroom. Margaret was gone as well. Bruce didn't think much of it. He assumed Georgia had gone home early with her mother. Vanessa stood beside him as the staff began clearing the tables. "That went well," she said. Bruce nodded, loosening his tie. "It always does." Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "You were a little harsh earlier," she said. Bruce smiled faintly. "You mean about Margaret?" Vanessa shrugged. "It was funny." Bruce laughed. "My mother-in-law has spent her entire life pretending money doesn't matter," he said. "It's a strange philosophy." Vanessa picked up her clutch. "Well, she certainly looked like she doesn't spend much of it." Bruce finished the champagne in his glass. "Exactly." Outside, a driver pulled Bruce's car to the curb. Vanessa leaned closer before stepping toward her own ride. "Text me when you get home," she said quietly. Bruce nodded. "I will." He didn't notice the doorman watching the brief exchange with polite neutrality. Across the city, Georgia and Margaret sat quietly in Margaret's kitchen. The house was still. A single lamp above the dining table cast a warm circle of light over the wooden surface. Margaret had removed her coat and hung it carefully near the door. Neither woman spoke for several minutes. Georgia poured tea into 2 cups and slid one across the table to her mother. Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic. "Thank you for inviting me tonight," she said calmly. Georgia looked at her. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." Margaret took a slow sip of tea. "I've heard worse in business." Georgia studied her mother's face. "You weren't angry?" Margaret set the cup down. "Anger is rarely productive," she replied. Georgia nodded slightly. "That's what I thought you would say." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "But humiliation can clarify things." Georgia waited. Margaret continued. "For many years I chose not to pursue the debt Bruce owes, not because the contract was unclear, but because you were married." Georgia lowered her eyes briefly. "I know." Margaret folded her hands on the table. "Tonight made something very clear to me." Georgia looked up again, but Margaret's voice remained steady. "Bruce Caldwell believes there are no consequences left." The sentence hung quietly between them. Georgia considered it carefully. "He probably does," she said. Margaret watched her daughter for a moment. "You've known for some time that his behavior has changed?" Georgia didn't pretend otherwise. "Yes." How long? Georgia thought for a moment. Long enough to start documenting things. Margaret's expression softened slightly. Of course you did. Georgia stood and walked toward the hallway that led to Margaret's office. Can I see the file? She asked. Margaret nodded. It's in the cabinet. Georgia entered the office and opened the gray steel drawer Margaret had maintained for years. Inside were the folders she had already reviewed once before. But this time, she looked at them differently. She carried the main folder back to the dining table. The documents inside felt heavier now, not physically, but in meaning. Georgia flipped through the pages slowly. Promissory note, wire transfer confirmation, email acknowledgments. Each document carried Bruce's name. Each one tied him clearly to the debt he had gradually ignored. Georgia reached the printed email from several years earlier. Margaret, I know we still need to resolve the remaining balance from the Evanston project loan. I haven't forgotten. Georgia read it again. He wrote this himself, she said quietly. Margaret nodded. Yes. Georgia closed the folder. How much is still owed? Margaret answered without hesitation. Just over $2 million, including accumulated interest. Georgia sat back in her chair. Bruce had spent far more than that on development projects over the past few years. He had purchased a new office floor for Caldwell Development. He had hosted lavish investor events. And yet he had not repaid the person who had allowed his company to survive its first collapse. Georgia looked at her mother. Why didn't you ever confront him directly? Margaret smiled faintly. Because I didn't need to. Georgia waited. Margaret continued. Borrowers reveal themselves over time. Pressure isn't always necessary. Georgia understood that philosophy well. Silence often created space for people to show exactly who they were. And Bruce had shown it clearly. Georgia opened her laptop and placed it on the table. I've been documenting some things too, she said. Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly. Georgia clicked through several folders. Credit card statements, travel confirmations, calendar entries, and a photograph of a restaurant receipt. Margaret examined the files calmly. Vanessa Hartley, she said after a moment. Georgia nodded. Yes. Margaret closed the laptop gently. You're thinking about leaving the marriage? It was not a question. Georgia didn't deny it. I'm thinking about what comes next. Margaret studied her daughter's face. You've already begun preparing. Georgia folded her hands on the table. Yes. Margaret considered that quietly. Then she said something very simple. If you decide to move forward, the debt will no longer remain inactive. Georgia nodded slowly. I expected that. Margaret opened the folder again and looked at Bruce's signature on the original promissory note. It has always been enforceable, she said. Georgia asked one final question. If it becomes necessary, are you ready to enforce it? Margaret closed the folder. Her answer came without hesitation. I have been ready for 10 years. In another part of the city, Bruce Caldwell poured himself a drink in the quiet kitchen of the townhouse he shared with Georgia. He glanced briefly at his phone. A message from Vanessa appeared. Did you make it home? Bruce smiled slightly and typed a reply. He never considered that across the city 2 women were sitting at a kitchen table, reviewing documents that connected directly to his financial future. And for the first time in years, those documents were no longer simply being preserved. They were being considered. The office of Daniel Whitaker occupied the 20th floor of a quiet building overlooking the Chicago River. Unlike the glass towers that housed large corporate firms, Whitaker's office had a quieter reputation. The lobby was understated. The reception area held simple leather chairs and shelves of legal books that appeared used rather than decorative. Georgia arrived 10 minutes early. Punctuality had always been one of her habits. She sat calmly in the reception area, her laptop bag resting beside her chair. Inside were several folders containing copies of the documents she and Margaret had reviewed the night after the gala. The receptionist greeted her politely. Mr. Whitaker will see you shortly. Georgia nodded. Through the large window behind the reception desk, the gray surface of the river moved steadily beneath the bridges of downtown Chicago. It was a calm morning, but Georgia knew the meeting she had scheduled was not casual. 10 minutes later, the office door opened. Daniel Whitaker stepped out. He was in his early 50s with the composed posture of someone who had spent decades listening to complicated situations before offering advice. "Miss Winslow," he said with a professional smile. "Please come in." Georgia followed him into his office. The room was neat but lived in. A wide wooden desk faced 2 chairs, and behind it stood tall shelves filled with case files. Whitaker gestured for Georgia to sit. "How can I help you today?" he asked. Georgia placed her laptop bag on the table and removed a thick folder. "I need legal clarity," she said. Whitaker nodded. "That's a good place to start." Georgia opened the folder and slid several documents across the desk. Whitaker adjusted his glasses and began reading. The first document was the promissory note. Bruce Caldwell's signature sat clearly at the bottom of the page. Whitaker read silently for several minutes. Then he moved to the next document. Wire transfer confirmation, email acknowledgments, revised payment schedules. Georgia waited patiently while he continued reviewing the file. Finally, Whitaker leaned back slightly in his chair. "This loan," he said calmly, "was issued by your mother's lending firm, yes?" Whitaker tapped the promissory note. "And Bruce Caldwell is the borrower, yes?" Whitaker flipped through the pages again. "Has any legal action been taken regarding repayment?" "No," Whitaker nodded slowly. "How much remains outstanding?" "Approximately $2 million, Georgia said. Whitaker folded his hands together. "And you are currently married to Mr. Caldwell?" Georgia didn't hesitate. "Yes." Whitaker considered the situation carefully. "This creates 2 overlapping legal matters," he said. "A private debt and a marital financial relationship." Georgia listened closely. Whitaker continued. "The loan itself appears properly documented and enforceable. The written acknowledgments from Mr. Caldwell strengthen that position significantly." He tapped the printed email Georgia had placed near the top of the file. "This message alone confirms he recognized the debt years after the original agreement." Georgia nodded. "That's what my mother believed." Whitaker closed the folder. "Your mother was correct?" He paused before asking the next question. "Are you planning to file for divorce?" Georgia met his eyes calmly. "Yes." Whitaker nodded once. "Then the debt becomes even more significant." He reached for a legal pad and began writing. "If a divorce proceeding begins, financial disclosures will be required from both parties. That includes debts, assets, and outstanding financial obligations." Georgia understood what he was implying. "If Bruce has ignored this debt in financial disclosures," she said quietly, "that becomes a problem." Whitaker nodded. "Potentially a very serious one." He turned the notepad so Georgia could see the outline he was writing. Step 1. Confirm enforceability of the loan. Step 2. Review Bruce Caldwell's financial records. Step 3. Identify any attempts to conceal assets or liabilities. Whitaker looked up. "To do that properly, I would recommend involving a forensic accountant." Georgia had expected that answer. "My mother mentioned the same thing." Whitaker smiled faintly. "Your mother sounds like someone who understands financial risk." Georgia didn't comment. Whitaker reached for his phone. "I know someone who specializes in these situations," he said. "Her name is Olivia Grant." He dialed a number and waited. "Olivia, it's Daniel Whitaker," he said when the call connected. "I have a client who may require a financial review involving private lending and corporate transactions." He listened for a moment. "Yes, Chicago-based, Caldwell Development Group." Whitaker glanced at Georgia. "Can you meet us tomorrow?" Another pause. "Excellent." Whitaker hung up and looked back at Georgia. "She'll join us here tomorrow morning." Georgia nodded. "That works." Whitaker closed the folder containing Bruce's loan documents. "For now," he said calmly, "I recommend continuing exactly as you have been." Georgia raised an eyebrow slightly. "Document everything," Whitaker smiled. "Yes." The next morning, Olivia Grant arrived at Whitaker's office, carrying a slim laptop and a stack of blank legal notebooks. She was in her early 40s with the focused energy of someone accustomed to analyzing large amounts of financial data. Whitaker introduced her to Georgia. Olivia works primarily with financial fraud cases and complex divorce proceedings, he explained. Olivia shook Georgia's hand. I've reviewed companies far larger than Caldwell Development, she said. But smaller firms often hide more interesting details. Georgia opened her laptop and showed Olivia the digital folder she had been building over the past year. Credit card statements, travel records, company expense reimbursements. Olivia scanned the documents quickly. You've been collecting these for a while, she observed. Georgia nodded. I started noticing inconsistencies. Olivia leaned back slightly. Inconsistencies are where most investigations begin. Whitaker slid the loan documents across the desk. And this, he said, is the financial background. Olivia studied the promissory note carefully. $3.2 million, she said softly. Yes. Olivia flipped through the payment records. Then she stopped at Bruce's email, acknowledging the debt. Interesting, she murmured. Whitaker asked the obvious question. What are you thinking? Olivia looked up. If Bruce Caldwell has been presenting himself publicly as financially stable while ignoring this obligation, there may be other financial discrepancies. Georgia remained silent. Olivia continued. Especially if company funds are being used in ways that aren't reflected in official records. Whitaker nodded. That's exactly what we need to determine. Olivia opened her laptop. I'll need access to every financial document you've saved so far, she told Georgia. Georgia transferred the folder immediately. Olivia skimmed several credit card statements. Then she paused. This charge, she said, pointing to one line. Luxury hotel suite, 2 nights. Georgia leaned closer. That was during one of Bruce's investor meetings. Olivia typed a note. Maybe. She looked up again. But if we're going to understand where Caldwell Development's money is going, we'll need to review more than just receipts. Whitaker nodded. Bank transfers, he said. Olivia smiled slightly. Yes. She closed the laptop for a moment. If Bruce Caldwell believes his finances are invisible, she said calmly, he's about to discover that numbers rarely stay hidden forever. Georgia sat quietly while the two professionals discussed the next steps. The conversation was technical. Banking subpoenas, corporate expense trails, personal accounts. But Georgia understood the meaning behind it all. For years, Bruce had assumed the past had been forgotten. Now the past was about to be examined line by line. And unlike conversation, financial records did not change their story. Olivia Grant began with the simplest principle she trusted. Follow the money. Financial records, in her experience, behaved very differently from people. They didn't change their tone, forget details, or adjust their stories depending on who was asking questions. Numbers were consistent. Which meant that when numbers didn't align, something else had changed. 3 days after meeting Georgia Winslow and Daniel Whitaker, Olivia sat in her small office reviewing the first batch of documents she had received. Georgia had been meticulous. Credit card statements, shared household banking activity, travel confirmations, calendar records. All of it had been organized chronologically. Olivia appreciated that kind of preparation. It shortened the time required to detect patterns. Her laptop displayed 2 columns of data. On the left were Bruce Caldwell's personal credit card transactions. On the right were Caldwell Development's corporate expense reports. Olivia compared dates first. That was always the easiest place to begin. Several entries matched exactly as expected. Business dinners charged to the company card. Travel expenses for investor meetings. Nothing unusual. But then Olivia noticed something interesting. A weekend in late March. Bruce had recorded the trip as an investor strategy retreat in Milwaukee, but the corporate expense report listed only 1 hotel room. Olivia zoomed in on the receipt. A luxury hotel overlooking Lake Michigan. Suite booking, 2 nights. The amount was higher than a standard business room. Olivia checked the personal credit card column. There it was, a dinner charge from a nearby restaurant. 2 guests. She made a note. Then she continued. The next pattern appeared in airline records. Bruce frequently traveled for company meetings. That was expected. But Olivia noticed something subtle. Several trips were purchased through the company travel account. Others were booked personally. The personal bookings often occurred on dates immediately adjacent to business travel, which meant Bruce would attend a meeting one day and remain in the same city another day without company documentation explaining why. Olivia leaned back slightly in her chair. "Interesting," she murmured. She opened a third window on her screen. Georgia's calendar notes. The dates matched. Many of the unexplained extra nights corresponded with the presence of Vanessa Hartley on the company schedule. Olivia tapped her pen lightly against the desk. Affairs were common in the cases she worked. They rarely surprised her. But what interested Olivia more was the financial structure surrounding them. She opened the Caldwell Development corporate ledger. The company was doing well. Several recent projects had produced strong returns, which made something else stand out: the absence of repayment activity toward Margaret Winslow's loan. Olivia searched the company transfer records. Nothing. No payments, not even partial transfers. She opened another spreadsheet and entered a simple calculation. Original loan amount, payments received, accumulated interest, remaining balance. The number appeared clearly on her screen: $2,084,000. Bruce Caldwell had allowed a debt of more than $2 million to remain unpaid while the company continued funding luxury travel and high-end corporate events. Olivia made another note. Then she noticed something that made her pause. A series of transfers labeled consulting services. The payments appeared irregular but consistent over several months. Each transfer was around $18,000 to $22,000. Olivia clicked into the details. The payments were not going to a consulting firm. They were being transferred to a personal account. Account holder, Vanessa Hartley. Olivia frowned slightly. She opened the payroll records. Vanessa Hartley was already receiving a salary as marketing director. The consulting transfers were separate. Olivia scrolled further. There were 9 payments over the past year. Total nearly $180,000. Olivia leaned back in her chair again. That kind of financial overlap could mean many things. But in the context of a divorce investigation, it raised obvious questions. She picked up her phone and dialed Daniel Whitaker. Whitaker answered on the second ring. Daniel Whitaker. "It's Olivia." "What did you find?" Olivia looked back at the spreadsheet. "Several things." Whitaker waited. Olivia continued. "Bruce Caldwell hasn't made any recorded attempt to repay the loan from Margaret Winslow in years." Whitaker nodded to himself. "That part we expected." "Yes," Olivia said. "But there's more." She explained the hotel expenses, the travel patterns, the consulting transfers to Vanessa Hartley. Whitaker remained quiet while she spoke. When she finished, he asked a simple question. "Is any of it illegal?" Olivia answered carefully. "Not necessarily." Whitaker exhaled slowly. But Olivia looked at the spreadsheet again. If Caldwell development funds were used to conceal personal expenditures or relationships that affect financial disclosures, it becomes relevant in court. Whitaker understood immediately. In a divorce proceeding, yes. Whitaker paused for a moment. "And the debt?" Olivia closed one of the spreadsheets. "The debt is still legally active." Whitaker glanced at the file sitting on his desk. Bruce acknowledged it in writing. Multiple times, Olivia confirmed. Whitaker leaned back in his chair. "If Bruce has been representing himself publicly as financially stable while ignoring a $2 million private obligation..." Olivia finished the sentence. "Then that representation could become very uncomfortable once financial disclosures begin." Whitaker smiled faintly. "Georgia will want to see this." Later that afternoon, Georgia returned to Whitaker's office. Olivia connected her laptop to a screen mounted on the wall. Several spreadsheets appeared. Georgia studied them silently. Olivia walked her through the data step by step. Travel records, expense reports, consulting payments. Georgia listened without interrupting. Finally, Olivia displayed the calculation of Bruce's remaining debt. The number sat plainly on the screen. $2.084000. Georgia looked at it for a long moment. "He hasn't paid anything in years," she said quietly. Whitaker folded his hands on the desk. "No." Georgia asked the next question calmly. "And the consulting payments?" Olivia nodded toward the screen. "They appear to be additional transfers to Vanessa Hartley beyond her salary." Georgia absorbed the information without visible emotion. She had suspected the relationship, but seeing it quantified was something different. Whitaker watched her carefully. "Georgia," he said gently, "once divorce proceedings begin, Bruce will be required to disclose all debts and assets." Georgia nodded. "And if he doesn't," Whitaker answered calmly, "then the records will speak for him." Olivia closed the laptop. "Numbers are patient," she said. "They wait until someone asks the right question." Georgia stood and gathered her folder. For the first time since the investigation had begun, she felt the quiet shape of the situation becoming clear. Bruce Caldwell believed his life was built on success. But beneath that success lay something he had ignored for years. A debt, $2 million, and documents carrying his own signature. Documents that had waited quietly for someone to read them again. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning. Bruce Caldwell found it on the corner of his desk when he walked into his office at Caldwell Development Group. His assistant had placed it neatly beside the stack of documents he usually reviewed before the day's meetings began. At first glance, it looked like ordinary correspondence. Plain white envelope, professional letterhead. Return address, Whitaker and Hale Attorneys at Law. Bruce frowned slightly. He didn't recognize the firm. He slit the envelope open with a silver letter opener and unfolded the document inside. The first line made him pause. Formal notice of default promissory note. Dated April 14th. Bruce read the sentence again. Then he scanned further down the page. The letter was precise. Legal language arranged with calm efficiency. It referenced the loan issued by Winslow Capital Lending 10 years earlier. It listed the remaining balance. It attached copies of Bruce's written acknowledgments, confirming the debt. And it concluded with a clear statement. This letter serves as formal notice that the outstanding balance of $2.084000 is now due. Failure to respond within the stated time frame may result in legal enforcement proceedings. Bruce leaned back slowly in his chair. For a moment, he simply stared at the page. Then he laughed quietly. The sound carried more disbelief than humor. "This can't be serious," he murmured. He flipped the page over. Attached were copies of emails. Emails he vaguely remembered sending years earlier. Margaret Winslow, the Evanston loan. Bruce's jaw tightened slightly. He hadn't thought about that loan in years. Not seriously, anyway. He had always assumed Margaret understood the situation. The company had grown. The money had served its purpose. Eventually, everything balanced out in family arrangements. Or so he believed. Bruce set the letter on his desk and reached for his phone. He dialed George's number. The call rang several times. Then it connected. "Hello." George's voice sounded calm. Bruce didn't bother with greetings. "Did you know about this?" he asked. "About what?" Bruce glanced down at the letter. "This ridiculous legal notice from your mother." There was a brief pause. "Yes," Georgia said. Bruce blinked. "You knew yes." Bruce's irritation sharpened. "So you're part of this," Georgia answered quietly. "I'm aware of it." Bruce leaned forward over the desk. "Georgia, this is absurd," he said. "That loan was 10 years ago." "Yes." Bruce waited for her to continue. She didn't. He tapped the letter with his finger. "We had an understanding." George's voice remained steady. "You had a contract." Bruce exhaled sharply. "That's not the same thing." Georgia didn't argue. "Bruce," she said calmly, "you should speak with your attorney." Bruce's eyes narrowed. "My attorney? Yes." Bruce realized something then. "Georgia, what exactly is going on?" There was another pause. Then Georgia said the words Bruce had not expected to hear that morning. "I filed for divorce yesterday." Silence filled the space between them. Bruce leaned back in his chair slowly. "You're serious?" "Yes." Bruce stared at the city skyline through his office window. "This is about Vanessa." Georgia didn't answer immediately. "Bruce," she said finally, "the reasons will be explained in the legal filings." Bruce laughed again. Short, sharp. "So that's it," he said. "You and your mother decided to coordinate this little financial ambush." Georgia didn't respond to the accusation. Instead, she repeated the same sentence she had said earlier. "You should speak with your attorney." Then the line went quiet. Georgia had ended the call. Bruce sat motionless for several seconds. Then he reached for his phone again and dialed another number. His lawyer answered almost immediately. "Richard Lawson." "Richard, it's Bruce Caldwell." "Bruce, what can I do for you?" Bruce slid the letter across his desk. "I just received a notice of default for a loan from my mother-in-law's old lending company." There was a brief pause. How much? Bruce hesitated. "About $2 million. Another pause. "That's not insignificant." Bruce rubbed his forehead. "It's old," he said. 10 years. "Did you repay it, partially?" Lawson's voice sharpened slightly. "Bruce, did you sign a promissory note?" "Yes." "Did you acknowledge the debt in writing?" After that, Bruce looked at the emails attached to the letter. "Yes." Lawson sighed quietly. "Then the debt is likely still enforceable." Bruce felt a flicker of irritation. "They waited 10 years. That doesn't necessarily invalidate the obligation," Lawson replied. Bruce leaned forward again. "And Georgia filed for divorce yesterday." Lawson was silent for a moment. "That complicates things." Bruce asked the obvious question. How Lawson answered carefully. "In divorce proceedings, all financial obligations must be disclosed. If this debt exists, it becomes part of the financial picture." Bruce stared at the city again. "And if I challenge it, you can," Lawson said. "But the documentation will matter." Bruce looked at the letter again. The documentation appeared thorough. Lawson continued. "There's another issue. What if Georgia's legal team requested financial discovery? They may already be reviewing your company accounts." Bruce's stomach tightened slightly. "That's unnecessary." Lawson didn't respond immediately. "Bruce," he said finally, "are there any financial arrangements you would prefer not to appear in court records?" Bruce didn't answer right away. Vanessa's consulting payments flickered briefly in his mind. But he dismissed the thought. "They won't find anything important," he said. "When I saw," Lawson cleared his throat. "Just to be clear," he said, "if your company funds have been used in ways that could affect marital asset division, those transactions will be examined." Bruce felt the irritation returning. "This is turning into a circus." Lawson's voice remained calm. "Divorces involving businesses often do." Bruce ended the call a few minutes later. He sat in silence for a while, the letter still lying open on his desk. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa. Lunch later, Bruce stared at the screen. For the first time since receiving the letter, something like unease moved quietly through his thoughts. Because the situation unfolding around him was no longer just about a marriage ending. It involved lawyers, financial records, and a debt he had convinced himself no longer mattered. But somewhere across the city, those documents were already being organized carefully by people who understood exactly how much they mattered. Bruce Caldwell had always believed that most problems could be managed with confidence. Confidence had built his company. Confidence had convinced investors to trust projects that existed only on blueprints. Confidence had carried him through difficult negotiations, collapsing deals, and uncertain financial cycles. So when the notice of default and the divorce filing arrived in the same week, Bruce's first instinct was not panic, it was control. By Friday afternoon, Bruce sat across from Richard Lawson in the lawyer's office overlooking Wacker Drive. The blinds were partially drawn, filtering the late autumn sunlight into narrow stripes across the conference table. Lawson had several documents spread out in front of him. The promissory note, the payment records, copies of Bruce's own emails acknowledging the loan. Lawson tapped one page with his pen. You understand the problem here, he said calmly. Bruce leaned back in his chair. The problem is that Margaret decided to turn a family matter into a legal one. Lawson raised an eyebrow slightly. This was never a family matter, he said. It was a formal loan. Bruce waved his hand dismissively. 10 years ago. That doesn't change the documentation. Bruce rubbed his temple. She waited until Georgia filed for divorce. Lawson nodded. That timing is strategic. Bruce looked up. So what do we do? Lawson considered the question. There are several options, he said. He began listing them one by one. First, we can attempt to negotiate a settlement of the loan. Bruce shook his head immediately. I'm not writing a $2 million check because Margaret decided to make a point. Lawson continued. Second, we could challenge the enforceability of the debt in court. Bruce looked interested. That sounds better. Lawson held up a hand. But the written acknowledgments weakened that argument. Bruce exhaled slowly, and the divorce Lawson turned to another document. George's filing requests full financial disclosure. Bruce frowned. That's standard. Yes, Lawson said. But the scope can expand if financial misconduct is suspected. Bruce's expression hardened slightly. There's no misconduct. Lawson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened a folder containing a preliminary review of Caldwell Development's financial records. We'll need to review your accounts carefully before the discovery process begins, he said. Bruce nodded. That's fine. Lawson studied him. Bruce, is there anything we should address before opposing counsel finds it? Bruce understood the question. He thought briefly of the consulting transfers to Vanessa. But those payments had been labeled properly in the accounting system. Consulting services, marketing strategy. There was nothing illegal about consulting payments. At least, that's what Bruce believed. No, he said. Lawson closed the folder slowly. Very well. Later that evening, Bruce met Vanessa Hartley at a restaurant overlooking the river. The room was softly lit with floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the lights of passing boats. Vanessa arrived first. She looked up when Bruce approached the table. You look stressed, she said. Bruce sat down. It's been an unusual week. Vanessa studied him. What happened? Bruce signaled the waiter for a drink. My wife filed for divorce. Vanessa blinked once. Then she leaned back slightly in her chair. Well, I suppose that was coming eventually. Bruce gave a small laugh. That obvious Vanessa shrugged. People notice things. The waiter returned with Bruce's drink. He took a sip before continuing. There's another complication. Vanessa waited. My mother-in-law sent a legal notice demanding repayment of an old loan. Vanessa tilted her head. How old? 10 years. And how much? Bruce hesitated. A little over $2 million. Vanessa's eyebrows lifted. That's not exactly small. Bruce stared out the window. It's temporary, he said. Lawyers are handling it. Vanessa studied him carefully. You're not worried? Bruce smiled faintly. I built this company from nothing, he said. I've handled worse situations. Vanessa nodded slowly, but she did not look entirely convinced. What does Georgia want? She asked. Bruce shrugged. Half of everything, probably. Vanessa picked up her glass. And the loan? Bruce waved the question away. That's just Margaret trying to pressure me. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. Do you actually owe it? Bruce hesitated. Technically. Vanessa laughed quietly. Technically sounds expensive. Bruce didn't respond. The conversation drifted toward safer topics after that. But Vanessa's expression remained thoughtful. Because for the first time since she had met Bruce Caldwell, she realized something. His confidence had cracks. Small ones, but visible. Across the city, Georgia sat once again in Daniel Whitaker's office. Olivia Grant had brought updated financial reports. Whitaker placed them neatly on the conference table. Bruce has hired Richard Lawson, he said. Georgia nodded. That's not surprising. Whitaker slid a document toward her. This is the initial response from his legal team regarding the loan. Georgia read it quietly. Lawson had requested additional documentation, promissory note verification, payment history, communication records. Georgia looked up. He's trying to delay. Whitaker nodded. That's common. Olivia leaned forward slightly. But delay won't change the numbers. She opened her laptop and displayed the updated financial summary. Georgia studied it. More consulting transfers had appeared. More travel expenses. Olivia pointed to a line on the spreadsheet. This payment happened 3 weeks ago. Georgia recognized the date. That was when Bruce told me he was attending a development conference. Olivia zoomed in on the transaction. The payment had been transferred to Vanessa Hartley's account. Georgia remained silent. Whitaker watched her carefully. Georgia, he said gently, these records will eventually be presented in court. Georgia nodded slowly. I know. Whitaker leaned back. Once formal discovery begins, Bruce's financial statements will be examined line by line. Olivia added quietly, and numbers rarely cooperate with stories. Georgia closed the folder in front of her. For the first time since the process began, she felt the structure of what was coming. Lawyers, financial records, courtrooms, not dramatic confrontations, just evidence. Whitaker spoke again. The next step will likely be a preliminary hearing regarding the debt claim. Georgia nodded, and the divorce Whitaker folded his hands. That process will move in parallel. Georgia stood slowly. Outside the window, the late afternoon light reflected off the river. The city looked calm. But beneath that calm, the quiet machinery of legal procedure had already begun turning. And Bruce Caldwell, who had once laughed in a ballroom while calling Margaret Winslow a beggar, was about to discover that the past rarely disappears. It simply waits for the right moment to return. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early winter. The courthouse stood in the center of downtown Chicago, a building whose heavy stone exterior suggested permanence. Inside, the hallways were quiet, except for the soft echo of footsteps and the occasional murmur of lawyers reviewing files with their clients. Bruce Caldwell arrived early. He wore a dark suit and a calm expression that he had practiced in boardrooms for years. The look suggested control, composure, and confidence. But the courthouse was not a boardroom, and confidence had a different weight here. Beside him walked Richard Lawson, carrying a leather briefcase filled with documents. Lawson had reviewed the case carefully over the past several weeks. The situation was not catastrophic, but it was uncomfortable. And the more documentation Whitaker's firm produced, the narrower Bruce's room for maneuver became. They entered the small courtroom assigned to the hearing. The room held 2 long tables facing the judge's bench. A few chairs along the back wall were reserved for observers. Bruce scanned the room immediately. At the opposite table sat Daniel Whitaker. Beside him was Olivia Grant, her laptop already open. And next to them sat Georgia Winslow. Georgia wore a simple gray suit. Her posture was relaxed, her expression calm. She looked exactly the same as she had during the charity gala weeks earlier. Quiet, observant. Bruce noticed something else. Margaret Winslow was seated 1 row behind Georgia. She looked exactly the way she always did. Modest coat, gray hair tied neatly back, hands folded calmly in her lap. Bruce felt the same flicker of irritation he had felt at the gala. Margaret didn't look like someone capable of threatening his company. But the file sitting on Whitaker's table told a different story. The judge entered the courtroom a few minutes later. Everyone stood. After brief introductions, the judge reviewed the matter before the court. A claim regarding enforcement of a private lending agreement, the judge said, glancing down at the file. Whitaker stood first. Your Honor, the documentation is straightforward. He approached the bench and placed several papers on the clerk's desk. The promissory note signed by Bruce Caldwell, the borrower, the payment records, and multiple written acknowledgments confirming the outstanding balance. The judge examined the documents. Whitaker continued. The remaining balance is approximately $2 million. The borrower has not made payments for several years. The judge looked toward Lawson. Mr. Lawson stood calmly. Your Honor, while the original loan exists, the circumstances surrounding its enforcement deserve closer examination. He walked forward. This agreement was made within the context of a family relationship. The judge looked at the promissory note again. Was the agreement documented? Yes, Lawson admitted. Was it signed by both parties? Yes. Were payments made? Yes. Did the borrower acknowledge the debt in writing afterward? Lawson paused briefly. Yes. The judge leaned back slightly. Then what exactly is the dispute? Lawson spoke carefully. We are requesting additional time to review the financial circumstances and explore possible settlement discussions. Whitaker remained still. Then he spoke again. Your Honor, the borrower has already had ample time to address this obligation. The documentation demonstrates clear acknowledgement and default. The judge studied the documents for several moments. Finally, he looked toward Bruce. Mr. Caldwell, do you dispute signing this promissory note? Bruce shifted slightly in his chair. No. Do you dispute receiving the funds? No. Do you dispute sending these emails, acknowledging the remaining debt? Bruce glanced briefly at Lawson. No. The judge nodded slowly. Then the issue before this court appears quite narrow. Whitaker spoke again. Your Honor, we are requesting formal enforcement proceedings to begin. Lawson quickly added, we request the opportunity to negotiate a repayment structure. The judge considered both arguments. Finally, he spoke. I will allow a limited period for settlement discussions. He looked directly at Bruce. But the documentation presented today is clear. If a resolution is not reached, promptly enforcement will proceed. The gavel struck softly. The hearing ended. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt colder than before. Bruce walked beside Lawson in silence for several seconds. Then he spoke. That judge was already leaning their direction. Lawson adjusted his glasses. The documentation makes their position strong. Bruce stopped walking. So what now? Lawson answered honestly. You negotiate. Bruce frowned. I'm not handing Margaret $2 million. Lawson looked at him steadily. Then you prepare for enforcement. Bruce's jaw tightened. What would that look like? Asset evaluation, Lawson said. Potential liens, financial disclosure. Bruce exhaled slowly. The word liens lingered unpleasantly in his mind. Across the hallway, Georgia and Whitaker stood speaking quietly. Margaret waited nearby. Bruce watched them. For the first time since the process began, he noticed something unsettling. None of them looked angry. Not Georgia, not Margaret, not even Whitaker. They simply looked prepared, as if the events unfolding were not dramatic or surprising, just procedural. Whitaker noticed Bruce watching them. He nodded politely. Bruce nodded back stiffly. Then he turned toward the elevator with Lawson. A few minutes later, Georgia stood beside Margaret near the courthouse entrance. Snow had begun falling lightly outside. Margaret adjusted her coat. That went about as expected, she said calmly. Georgia nodded. Yes. Whitaker joined them. The judge's position was predictable, he said. The documentation speaks clearly. Olivia closed her laptop bag. And the financial discovery for the divorce will continue regardless. Georgia looked toward the courthouse steps. Bruce and Lawson were leaving the building. Bruce walked quickly, speaking into his phone. He did not look back. Margaret watched him for a moment. Then she said quietly, confidence can be very persuasive. Georgia glanced at her. Margaret continued. But numbers are patient. Snow continued falling softly around them. Georgia placed her hands in her coat pockets. For years, Bruce Caldwell had believed the past had been settled. Now the past had returned in the form of signed documents and quiet legal procedures. And unlike conversations or reputations, those documents did not change their meaning with time. They simply waited for someone to read them again. Winter settled over Chicago with a slow persistence that the city knew well. Snow accumulated along sidewalks and the edges of streets, turning the sharp outlines of buildings into softer shapes beneath gray skies. The river moved quietly under the bridges, dark water cutting through the frozen air. For Bruce Caldwell, the weeks after the hearing did not pass quietly. At first, he believed the situation could still be contained. Richard Lawson arranged a series of negotiation meetings with Daniel Whitaker, attempting to restructure the debt Margaret Winslow had formerly claimed. Bruce proposed payment schedules, partial settlements, and delays tied to the cash flow of upcoming development projects. Whitaker listened politely, but the response never changed. The loan had clear terms. The documentation was complete. Margaret Winslow was willing to discuss timing, but not the legitimacy of the debt itself. And while those negotiations continued, another process moved forward at the same time. The financial discovery phase of Georgia's divorce filing. Olivia Grant worked steadily through Caldwell Development's financial records. Company accounts, corporate expense reports, investment transfers. Each document passed through her hands the way water passed through a filter, slowly, carefully leaving behind the details that did not belong. It was during that process that the next shift occurred. One morning, Bruce arrived at his office to find a new letter waiting on his desk. This one came from one of Caldwell Development's major investment partners. The message was polite, but cautious. They had been informed that legal proceedings involving Caldwell Development's financial obligations were ongoing. They requested clarification before committing additional funding to a new project Bruce had proposed. Bruce read the letter twice. Then he set it aside and stared out the window of his office. This was the first visible ripple. Investors disliked uncertainty. Even small legal disputes could cause hesitation. Bruce picked up the phone and called Lawson. "This is starting to affect business," he said. Lawson's voice remained calm. That's often how these situations unfold. Bruce leaned back in his chair. "So what do you recommend?" Lawson paused briefly. "The fastest resolution would be settling the loan." Bruce exhaled sharply. "That's still $2 million?" "Yes." Bruce said nothing, because the number had begun appearing everywhere in his thoughts. $2 million, a figure that once seemed insignificant compared to the scale of his company's projects. Now it felt heavier. Across the city, Olivia Grant reviewed another set of transaction records. She had already identified the consulting payments to Vanessa Hartley, but new data from subpoenaed bank records provided additional clarity. Several of those transfers had originated from corporate accounts before being categorized as consulting fees, which meant company funds had supported personal payments. Olivia prepared a summary report and delivered it to Whitaker's office. Georgia arrived later that afternoon to review the findings. Whitaker placed the report on the table between them. "These transactions will likely appear during divorce proceedings," he explained. Georgia read the document slowly. The numbers were exact. Dates, amounts, transfer accounts. Olivia spoke gently. "Bruce may argue the payments were legitimate consulting work." Georgia looked up. "Were they?" Olivia shrugged slightly. "That's a question the court will examine." Georgia closed the report. She didn't appear angry, just thoughtful. Whitaker watched her. "You understand how this affects the financial division," he said. Georgia nodded. "Yes," Whitaker continued. "And the debt claim remains separate from that process." Georgia looked toward the window. Snow had begun falling again. "Everything is connected now," she said quietly. Whitaker didn't disagree. Meanwhile, Bruce's personal life was changing in quieter ways. Vanessa Hartley had grown more distant. At first, she still met him for dinners and occasional weekends away from the city. But the conversations had shifted. The easy confidence she once admired in Bruce now carried something else: uncertainty. One evening, they sat together in a lounge overlooking Lake Michigan. Vanessa stirred her drink slowly. "How long will the divorce take?" she asked. Bruce shrugged. "Months, maybe longer." Vanessa nodded, and alone Bruce sighed, still negotiating. Vanessa looked down at the table. "You didn't tell me it was that large." Bruce frowned. "I didn't think it mattered." Vanessa studied him. $2 million usually matters. Bruce didn't respond. For the first time since they had met, the balance between them had shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Vanessa had always been drawn to Bruce's confidence. Now that confidence appeared less stable. And Vanessa Hartley had built her own career on recognizing opportunity, not uncertainty. One morning, near the end of winter, Bruce arrived at his office to find another letter waiting. This one came from the county records office. He opened it slowly. Inside was a notice related to preliminary lien consideration connected to the enforcement of Margaret Winslow's loan. Bruce read the document carefully. Then he set it down. For a long moment, he simply sat there, because the situation he once dismissed as a family disagreement had now reached a point where official records were beginning to move. Liens, asset disclosures, financial scrutiny. The machinery of law had begun its slow, methodical work. And once it began moving, it rarely reversed direction quickly. That afternoon, Bruce stood near the window of his office, looking down at the streets far below. Cars moved through the winter traffic. Pedestrians crossed intersections, bundled in heavy coats. The city continued exactly as it always had. But Bruce understood something now that he had not considered weeks earlier. His reputation, carefully constructed over years of business deals and public events, was no longer fully under his control. Not because anyone had publicly humiliated him, not because anyone had shouted accusations, but because documents existed. Documents with his signature. Documents that quietly described a debt he had once promised to repay. Across the city, Margaret Winslow closed the gray cabinet drawer in her office. The file inside had grown slightly thicker. Legal notices, court filings, correspondence between attorneys. Margaret placed the key back in its place and turned off the desk lamp. She did not feel satisfaction, only completion, because for many years she had allowed time to pass without enforcing the agreement. Not out of weakness, but out of patience. Now patience had simply reached its natural end. Spring arrived in Chicago quietly. The snow that had covered the sidewalks for months melted slowly into the gutters. Trees along the streets began showing small green leaves again, and sunlight reflected off the river with a brightness that had been absent during winter. For most people in the city, the season meant renewal. For Bruce Caldwell, it meant resolution. The negotiations that followed the preliminary hearing had continued for several weeks. Lawyers exchanged proposals. Payment schedules were drafted, revised, and rejected. But the situation had gradually narrowed to a point where there were few remaining possibilities. The documentation surrounding Margaret Winslow's loan was clear. Bruce Caldwell had borrowed $3.2 million. He had repaid only part of it. He had acknowledged the remaining balance several times in writing. And now, after years of silence, enforcement had begun. By early April, Bruce sat once again in Richard Lawson's office, reviewing the final proposal on the table. Lawson placed the document in front of him. "This is the settlement structure they're willing to accept," he said. Bruce read the page slowly. The agreement required Caldwell to repay the outstanding balance over a fixed schedule. But it also included something Bruce had not expected. To secure the repayment, certain company assets would serve as collateral until the debt was satisfied. Bruce leaned back in his chair. "That ties up half my development capital," he said. Lawson nodded. "Yes." Bruce looked out the window. "And if I refuse?" Lawson's voice remained calm. "Then enforcement proceeds." Bruce didn't ask what enforcement meant. He already knew. Asset liens, court supervision, public financial records. The quiet dismantling of the image he had spent years constructing. Bruce exhaled slowly. "Fine," he said. Lawson slid the agreement closer. "Then we finalize it." Bruce picked up the pen. For a moment, he hesitated. The signature he was about to write would not create a new obligation. It would simply confirm one that had existed for a decade. Bruce signed. Across the city, Georgia Winslow sat in a small conference room at Daniel Whitaker's office. Whitaker placed a document in front of her. "The divorce settlement terms," he said. Georgia read carefully. The financial division had been negotiated alongside the debt resolution. Bruce would retain control of Caldwell Development, but the structure of the agreement required a substantial redistribution of shared assets. Georgia closed the folder after several minutes. "This is acceptable," she said. Whitaker nodded. "There's one more thing." Georgia looked up. Whitaker slid another document across the table. "This confirms the repayment agreement between Bruce Caldwell and Margaret Winslow." Georgia recognized the structure immediately. Her mother had accepted a structured repayment instead of immediate enforcement. Whitaker studied Georgia's expression. "Your mother could have demanded faster action," he said. Georgia nodded. "I know." Whitaker smiled faintly. "She chose not to." Georgia closed the folder. "That sounds like her." Later that afternoon, Georgia drove to Margaret's house. The small home looked exactly as it always had. The garden along the front walkway had begun showing early spring flowers. Georgia knocked once before entering. Margaret sat in the living room reading a book. She looked up as Georgia stepped inside. "Hello." Georgia placed her bag on the table. "It's finished." Margaret closed the book gently. "The agreement, yes." Georgia sat down across from her. He signed. Margaret nodded. That was expected. Georgia watched her mother carefully. "You could have forced the matter much harder." Margaret shrugged slightly. "That wouldn't have improved anything." Georgia studied the quiet room around them. For a moment she remembered the charity gala, the laughter, the careless insult Bruce had spoken. She looked back at Margaret. "Did you ever want to confront him?" Margaret considered the question. "No." Georgia raised an eyebrow. Not even after what he said that night. Margaret smiled faintly. Humiliation often reveals more about the person speaking than the person hearing it. Georgia leaned back in her chair. "That sounds like something you've said before." Margaret nodded. "Probably." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Georgia spoke again. "The divorce will be finalized next month." Margaret looked at her daughter calmly. "And how do you feel about that?" Georgia thought for a moment. "Clear." Margaret studied her face. Not angry, Georgia shook her head. "No." Margaret seemed satisfied with that answer. Because anger had never been the goal. Understanding had. Across the city, Bruce Caldwell stood alone in his office late that evening. The building was quiet. Most employees had gone home hours earlier. On his desk sat several folders containing the final agreements he had signed that morning. Debt repayment schedule, asset collateral terms, legal confirmations. Bruce walked to the window. The city lights reflected off the river below. For years, he had believed success erased the past, that progress made earlier struggles irrelevant. Now he understood something different. The past did not disappear. It simply waited. Waiting in signatures, waiting in documents, waiting in quiet files inside gray cabinets. Bruce thought briefly of the night at the gala, the moment he had laughed and called Margaret Winslow a beggar. At the time, it had seemed like nothing, just another careless remark. Now it felt strangely distant, because the consequences of that moment had not arrived through anger. They had arrived through paperwork, through procedures, through patience. Bruce turned away from the window and gathered the folders from his desk. The building lights dimmed as he walked toward the elevator. Outside, the streets of Chicago continued their steady rhythm. Cars passed, people walked home. And somewhere across the city, a quiet house held a locked cabinet containing a file that had finally reached its conclusion. After everything was finished, the story did not end with applause or humiliation. There were no dramatic speeches, no public victory, only a quiet understanding that some truths move slowly. Georgia Winslow had never raised her voice. She had never argued in crowded rooms or demanded recognition for the things she knew. She had simply watched. She had written things down. And when the moment arrived, the records spoke for themselves. Bruce Caldwell had built his life on ambition and confidence. For many years, those qualities had served him well. But confidence can sometimes make people forget that actions leave traces behind them. Emails, contracts, bank transfers, small acknowledgments written years earlier and forgotten. Margaret Winslow had never needed to defend herself when Bruce mocked her that night in the ballroom. Because dignity does not require immediate answers. Sometimes, dignity simply waits. And when the truth finally appears, it does not shout. It arrives quietly, printed on paper, signed in ink, and impossible to ignore. If you've stayed with this story until the end, take a moment to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always fascinating to see how stories about patience and quiet strength travel across different places and cultures. And if stories like this resonate with you, stories where justice unfolds slowly but clearly, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Not because of noise or spectacle, but because sometimes the most powerful endings are the quiet ones.